Well, greetings everybody. My name is Toufic Haddad. I'm the director of the Kenyon Institute in Jerusalem. We're about to start the spectre of annexation, a conversation with Professor Avi Shlaim. For the next hour and 15 minutes, please grab yourself a cup of tea, get comfortable. We intend to explore the topic of annexation with Professor Shlaim. Start by introducing our topic today. Today we'd like to discuss the topic of the Israeli announced plans for annexation, which were announced at the end of May, when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that he intended to move forward with the practicalities of annexing up to 30% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley and some of the major settlement blocks. He announced that this would take place by July 1st, but up until today, these plans seem to have been stalled somewhat or in some form of elaboration as both inside the Israeli political establishment as well as inside the United States governing realm. There seems to be a degree of controversy and or elements of attempting to try and elaborate to what extent the annexation plans will or will not go forward. To discuss these issues today, we have distinguished Professor Emeritus from Oxford University, Professor Avi Shlaim. Professor Shlaim is an Emeritus Fellow of St. Antony's College, a former Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford, and an elected Fellow of the British Academy. Among his many books are Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. That was one of his best-known pieces in 1988, branding him what is known as the mantle of being a new historian, so to speak. Other well-known texts are The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, Lion of Jordan, King Hussein's Life in War and Peace, and the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, Origins and Consequences. Professor Shlaim is a frequent contributor to the newspapers and commentators on radio and television on Middle Eastern affairs. I can't think of anybody who is better qualified to provide us commentary on the subject of annexation today. So I'd like to thank you, Professor Shlaim, for coming today. Thank you firstly for having us. Professor Shlaim is joining us today from the UK, and we are from Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Toufic. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar with you. I have very fond memories of a conference organized by the Kenyon Institute in East Jerusalem in 2017 to mark the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. And it was a very well-attended seminar that you did in a cooperation with a bookshop in East Jerusalem. And it was a very successful seminar. And it's a pleasure for me to be the guest of the Kenyon Institute once again.
Bless you. Thank you, Professor Shlaim. So perhaps we can start with something simple. Can you please explain for our readers what some of the political implications around the question of annexation and why this topic is considered so controversial?
The thing about annexation is that it will only formalize, make official something that has been going on for the last 53 years. So there's been a creeping annexation of the occupied Palestinian territories ever since the end of the June 1967 war. So the reality is one of Israeli domination of the entire West Bank, complete and total Israeli domination, political, economic, and military. But after the end of the June 67 war, Israel put about a myth. The myth that the occupation was temporary. But this was only a myth it was never the real intention to keep to have only a temporary occupation pending a solution of a resolution of the conflict. How do we know that the Israelis never intended to end the occupation? We know that because they started building settlements. If you build civilian settlements, it's with the intention of staying there rather than withdrawing. What is the reason why annexation has aroused so much attention and provoked so much resistance is that it would make Israeli control of the West Bank official and formal. And secondly, it would be a clear breach of international law, because Israel is on the West Bank as an occupying power. I would add in parentheses that the Israeli occupation is the most prolonged and brutal military occupation of modern times. But occupation doesn't allow the occupier the right to sovereignty. So if Israel declared its sovereignty over a third of the West Bank or any part of the West Bank, that would be a blatant violation of international law, and it would be a challenge to the international legal system, because the UN has pronounced on innumerable occasions that the occupation is illegal. The settlements are illegal, each and every one of them. The annexation of East Jerusalem in late June 1967 is illegal. So if Israel can simply disregard international law and the UN, that's a real challenge to the international legal system and not just to Israel-Palestine. There is another reason why this plan of annexation is so controversial, and that is that it would confirm what Palestinians have known all along, and some Israelis have also realized. It would confirm that Israel is an apartheid state. If you look at Israel proper within its own borders, you can say it's a democracy. Flawed democracy, but all democracies are flawed. But there is procedural democracy. There are elections, there are political parties. But if you look at Israel and the West Bank, it most emphatically is not a democracy. It's an ethnocracy, a system in which one ethnic group dominates the other. There is another word to describe this situation, and that is apartheid. And Palestinians realize that they've been living under an apartheid system all along. My Israeli friends say to me, don't say that Israel is an apartheid country, because we're having this debate with our other Israelis, and we are warning them that this is the trend. And my reply to my left-wing Israelis is, wake up and smell the coffee. Just look around you. And if this is not apartheid, I don't know what is. So the proposal for annexation of part of the West Bank is controversial and is crucial precisely because it would make apartheid an official ideology and practice of the Israeli state. I can't hear you.
Sorry, sometimes it's quite loud out here, so I put the mute on. Excuse me.
Okay.
So I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak about the issue of timing of the maneuver around annexation. Some could casually say it has a lot to do with what's going on with Netanyahu himself, as well as the US administration today. But with that said, you also alluded in your previous answer to the fact that Israel may have had longer term plans around annexation and began building settlements quite fast afterwards. And in fact, if we look back, we do see plans from Israeli Minister of Defense back in 1967, Yigal Allon, raising the issue of settlements, etc. So can you speak about a little bit about intentionality as well as the timing of what's happening today?
Yes. Israel began to build settlements on the West Bank in July 1967. That early. People don't realize that. And immediately after the war, Yigal Allon, who was a minister in the government, proposed the Allon Plan. And the Allon Plan offered peace with Jordan by restoring not all, but part of the West Bank and Gaza as well to Hashemite rule. But under the Allon Plan, Israel was going to keep the whole city, old city of Jerusalem, and the area adjacent to Israel. And King Hussein rejected this offer. He said it's all or nothing. And he offered Israel, immediately after the war, he offered Israel total peace for total withdrawal. And this was known as the Jordanian option. Israel had a Jordanian option, but it didn't pursue it. And Israel also had a Palestinian option, which is to make peace with the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza. And the Palestinians took the initiative. In fact, it was Aziz Shehadeh, a West Bank prominent lawyer, the father of Raja Shehadeh, who presented Israel with a plan for peace between a mini Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza and the state of Israel. But Israel dismissed this plan as well. So Israel had a Jordanian plan and a Palestinian, a Jordanian option and a Palestinian option, but it didn't pursue either because there was a consensus in the government to keep the West Bank permanently. And then settlements started under Labour. The difference between Labour and the Likud is that Labour wanted to build settlements only in the strategically important areas that were intended for keeps. So under the Labour government, settlements were confined to the areas of the Allon Plan that were going to remain on the Israeli side. The intention was to maintain the possibility of territorial compromise over the West Bank. When the Likud came to power in 1977 under Menachem Begin, they had a different approach. Their approach to the West Bank was ideological rather than based on security. For them, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, was an integral part of the historic homeland. And therefore, they started building settlements across the breadth and the length of what they call the land of Israel in order to make territorial compromise impossible in the event of a Labour return to power. So the purpose of the settlements under the Likud was to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And this is still the main purpose of the settlements today, to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state. And even the state of Israel doesn't claim that the settlements are there for security reasons. It doesn't say so. It says they are there because this is the land of Israel.
Where does the United States administration fit into this when it comes to the historical arc of these plans? We know historically, in principle, the United States has backed the idea of land for peace, so to speak. But under the Trump administration now, we have something that's a different animal that's operating, so to speak. Can you explain or speak to where some of these policies come from? It's quite a strong paradigmatic shift for the United States to undertake and to supposedly back such a strong maneuver, no?
I would divide American presidents into two schools of thought when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Israel First school and the even-handed school. The Israel First school says Israel is the only democratic, modern, advanced, competent, rational ally we have in this turbulent region, and therefore our policy towards the region should be based on Israel. And the even-handed school says America's vital interests lie in the oil-producing areas of the Gulf. Too close a relationship with Israel will alienate the Arabs, and therefore we shouldn't abandon Israel, but we should be even-handed between Israelis and Arabs. And there were only two even-handed presidents, that's Jimmy Carter and Bush Sr. All the other presidents were Israel First. Reagan was very much an Israel First kind of president. Bush Jr. was even more fanatically pro-Israeli because he was surrounded by a group of neocons. But now with Trump in power, we have a new kind of animal, someone who is completely beyond the scale of Israel First, someone who doesn't recognize the Palestinians and doesn't recognize any Palestinian rights at all. So he does represent a paradigm shift, although the name probably wouldn't mean anything to him. But as you said, until now, it's been a consistent American policy of land for peace based on UN Resolution 242. And official American policy until the present, until Trump, said that the settlements are illegal and they are an obstacle to peace. Trump has completely jettisoned everything that went on before, and he now has delivered a series of body blows to the Palestinians. So he moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He recognized Israel's sovereignty over the whole of Jerusalem. He withdrew American aid to UNRWA. He then withdrew American aid to the Palestinian Authority, including aid to hospitals, humanitarian aid. He closed down the PLO office in Washington and expelled the ambassador. And he then recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which was a prelude to saying if Israel annexes part of the West Bank, he will recognize Israeli sovereignty over that part of the West Bank. So we've never encountered an American president who is so one-sided. And when Trump announced the deal of the century at the end of January of this year, the Palestinians were not there. By his side was Benjamin Netanyahu. And the Trump plan, Peace for Prosperity, as it is called, was drawn up by American Jews and by Israeli Jews. And the American Jews, oddly enough, are more right-wing than the Israeli Jews. Let's look at the people who advised Trump on this plan. One of them, the best known, is Jared Kushner, his Jewish son-in-law. Jared Kushner is a man in his mid-30s without any experience of public office, without any knowledge of the region. He is a property tycoon, and his family was close to the settlers and raised money for the settlements on the West Bank. David Friedman is his ambassador to Israel. Friedman was Trump's, he's Jewish, and he is an extreme right-wing Zionist. Friedman was Trump's bankruptcy lawyer. He arranged 4 bankruptcies for Trump. And Friedman has long advocated Israeli annexation of the settlement blocks. He was a fundraiser for Beit El, a hardline settlement block on the West Bank. So he, like Jared Kushner, are associated with the settlement lobby. David Friedman is now trying to organize a bankruptcy deal for the Palestinians to put them out of business. So Trump didn't put forward this one-sided plan because he loves Jews. He did it for his own selfish electoral reasons, because he has an election coming up in November, and he wants to curry favor to win the support of the Christian evangelists, and they think that Israeli annexation of the West Bank, of the land of Israel, is the word of God. That is his motive for pushing for annexation. It would win him support at home. And it's terrifying to think that American president could be so irresponsible, so reckless, that he would want to push something on Israel, annexation, which is irreversible, just because it suits his electoral purposes. Now, there's been a storm of protest against annexation from all different quarters, including American Jewish bodies who have warned against annexation. And this is why Jared Kushner has advised Netanyahu to hold back a bit, to wait a bit. And that's where we are today, that Netanyahu is not pushing ahead with annexation right away. He is playing a longer game to wait and see. One consideration for him is that Trump may lose the election and Joe Biden might become president, and he would reverse this trend of the last few years, and he may not recognize Israeli annexation of part of the West Bank. So that's where we are at the moment, in a state of a bit of uncertainty. But let me add just one other point about the domestic Israeli background to annexation. So Netanyahu has fought 3 elections in the last year, and all of them ended in a draw. So he made a coalition with Benny Gantz and his blue and white party, which is a centrist party. But when it comes to the West Bank, there isn't any significant difference between the two parties, Likud and blue and white. The coalition agreement said that after the 1st of July, Netanyahu can propose annexation either to the government or to the Knesset. So he's allowed to, but he's not compelled to propose annexation. What we do know is that there is a majority of about 80 members of the Knesset who would support annexation. The coalition government has a majority of 70 out of 120, and there are about 10 more extreme right-wing members of the Knesset who would support annexation. So Netanyahu is in a position to proceed with annexation, but for tactical reasons, he is holding back. Sorry, I would like to add one more point about Netanyahu specifically, and that is that Netanyahu is a status quo politician. The status quo since 1967 suits him to the ground, because it gives Israel complete control and domination over the whole of the West Bank, and it gives him a free hand to do whatever he wants, to expand settlements, to build infrastructure, to continue to build the security wall. That is why Netanyahu had never proposed annexation, because the status quo suits him completely. The initiative came from Trump and from David Friedman, and it suited him for his electoral reasons, because by saying before each of these last 3 elections that if elected, he would annex the settlement blocks, that appealed to right-wing voters and to the settlers. So there are a lot of conflicting political forces at play, which explain for the delay in annexation.
Thank you for that explanation. But I guess, you know, to play a bit of devil's advocate here, you yourself acknowledge that both the old labor movement as well as the revisionist Likudniks both had different support forms of settlement in the West Bank. Some had ideological, and the others had more supposed security strategic interests. The West has largely backed Israel, certainly on the concept of a secure Israel. So what Trump, as I read him, what he's saying is, this is a fait accompli. Areas like the Jordan Valley are strategic for Israel in the long term. And in any agreement, we would basically support some form of security guarantees and Israeli control over these areas, because it would be impossible to have a Palestinian entity controlling these borders to be able to allow access to the east. So I just want to make sure, because a lot of this debate is basically talking about the internal debates amongst Israelis as well as between Israelis and Americans. But I just want to be clear that how much this is really actually offering the Palestinians, because there really does seem to be a consensus amongst all those, despite their differences, that certain areas are actually off the table for the Palestinians. Correct or not?
Yes, correct. Because the overwhelming majority of Israelis would not give up on the settlements and would not dismantle settlements. and that's a substantial Israeli presence on the West Bank. But the fact that Zionism has always proceeded by creating facts on the ground rather than by having arguments or legal arguments or disputes, it's facts on the ground. And that's been the Zionist strategy all along from the beginning, and that's been the strategy of Israel under both Labour and Likud since 1967, creating facts on the ground. But that doesn't mean that the world has to accept that the settlements belong to Israel and that Israel has sovereign rights over the settlements. So the legal issue becomes very important here. As long as Israel built settlements and expanded settlements, there have been no international sanctions, because it was meant to be pending a peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, which would convert the armistice lines of 1949 into peace lines. But now it's clear that Israel does not intend to have a settlement with the Palestinians, that it is acting unilaterally, and if it becomes officially an apartheid state, there would be the prospect of international sanctions. Israel, the Zionist movement, from the beginning, has always depended on external support. External support was always crucial. So Zionism is a settler colonial movement. Noam Chomsky once observed that settler colonialism is the most extreme and vicious form of imperialism. The Palestinians have had the unique misfortune of being, for the last 100 years, at the receiving end, both of Zionist settler colonialism and Western imperialism. Western imperialism was represented by Britain in the first half of the 20th century and by America ever since. So it's a settler colonial movement which never intended to share the land with the Palestinians. The point about settler colonialism is that their aim is to displace, to eliminate the indigenous population, not to share. And it may sound a bit blunt, but I'll say it anyway. Zionism is essentially about land grabbing. It's about, the aim from the beginning was to establish a Jewish state, exclusive Jewish state, on as large a part of Palestine as possible, with as many Jews within its borders and as few Arabs as possible. In 1917, when Arthur Balfour made his famous declaration, the Jews were 10% of the population, the Arabs were 90%, and the Jews owned 2% of the land. And yet the British imperialists conceded only civil and religious rights to the Palestinian majority, but not national rights. They accorded national rights only to the Jewish minority. In other words, Palestinian rights didn't count. The Palestinians didn't exist. They had no rights. Only the Jews matter. And the cornerstone of the British mandate in Palestine was to prevent representative institutions until the Jews became the majority. In 1947, the UN voted for the partition of Palestine, dividing the Palestine mandate into two states, one Arab, one Jewish. At the time, the Jews were less than a third of the population, and they owned only 7% of the land, and yet the UN plan awarded them 55% of the population. Then there was the 1948 war, and at the end of the war, Israel signed armistice agreements with all its neighbors. By this time, the Zionist movement controlled 78% of historic Palestine, and the armistice agreements confirm these lines. The 1949 armistice agreements are the only internationally recognized agreements that Israel has ever had. In 1993, the PLO signed the Oslo Accord with Israel. By doing so, they gave up the claim to 78% of historic Palestine in the hope and expectation that they would get an independent Palestinian state on Gaza and the West Bank with a capital city in East Jerusalem. But it was not to be. This did not happen. After the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the Likud came back to power under Benjamin Netanyahu. This is in 1996, and Netanyahu immediately proceeded to dismantle the Oslo Accords and to continue settlement expansion. So settlement expansion continued after Oslo under both Labour and Likud governments, and today we have something like 650,000 settlers on the West Bank. This means that a two-state solution is no longer possible, even without Israel annexing a third of the West Bank. Most people today recognize that the two-state solution is dead. I would go further and say the two-state solution was never born because no Israeli government since 1967 has been serious about allowing an independent Palestinian state. And no American administration since 1967 has really pushed Israel to end the occupation and to allow for a Palestinian state. With Trump in power, we've moved a stage further where the American president says the Israeli settlements on the West Bank are legal, they are not an obstacle to peace, and Israel is entitled, Israel has a free pass to annex any part of the West Bank that it likes.
Thank you for that answer. I'd like to sort of take advantage of the fact that I'm talking to a well-known historian and particularly a new historian here. Your academic contributions, or you became known for being a new historian around your work on the 1948 war and the work in the archives, particularly. But I'd like to ask you if you could shed some light on what the new historians or what the archives have contributed to our understanding of what happened in 1967. I say that within the framework of, within the logic of basically that the annexation today derives from that period of time. And Israel always claimed, and the West backed it on the claim that this was a defensive war and that what Israel did there was necessary, so to speak. As a historian, can you speak to what we know now about the 1967 war?
Yes, but I have to go back to the 1948 war because that was the real root of the conflict. And the debate between the old historians and the new historians revolved around 1948. And in 1988, 3 books were published. You mentioned my own book, King Abdullah, Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdullah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine, in which I argued that there was a tacit agreement between King Abdullah and the Zionist Movement to partition Palestine between themselves at the expense of the Palestinians. Another book was by Benny Morris, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947-1949, and the book proved conclusively that the Palestinians did not leave of their own free will, that they were pushed out. And the third book was by Ilan Pape, Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1948 to 1951, in which he argued that Britain's aim towards the inglorious end of the Palestine Mandate was not to prevent the birth of a Jewish state, rather it was to prevent the birth of a Palestinian state, because in British eyes, a Palestinian state was synonymous with the Mufti state. The Mufti was a renegade, and therefore Britain conspired with its client, King Abdullah, to ditch the Palestinians. Britain gave him the green light to conquer the West Bank, the heartland of what was going to be a Palestinian state, and then later to annex it. So the new historians, my colleagues and I, challenge all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war. In my book, The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, I continued my critique of Israeli foreign policy for the first 50 years of statehood, from 1948 to 1998. Now I'll come to your question more specifically about the June 1967 war. Israel claims that it was a defensive war, a war of self-defense, and the war was forced on Israel by Arab provocation, and in the course of the war, Israel occupied the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Sinai Peninsula. The real question is, was this a defensive war or not? And my answer to that question is that it was not a defensive war, or rather, I'm sorry, I'll go back a bit. Israel's wars can be divided into wars of choice and wars of no choice. 1948 was clearly a war of no choice. Israel was attacked and it defended itself and won the war. The Sinai War of 1956 was a war of choice. Israel conspired with the colonial powers, Britain and France, to attack Egypt. So this was a classic war of choice. In May 1967, there was a crisis, and the crisis escalated. President Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. This was a challenge to Israel's rights, but there was a possibility of a diplomatic solution, and Nasser prepared to send his deputy president, Zakaria Mohoeddin, to talks in Washington. So there was a diplomatic route out, but Israel preempted. Israel launched the war with a surprise attack on Egypt. And Israeli propaganda gave a completely false picture of how the war broke out. It said that Egypt attacked Israel and the IDF responded to the attack, and that's how the war started. That's not how the war started. Israel initiated that war. Now, some Arabs think that this was a colonial project, that Israel was looking for an excuse to conquer the West Bank. I haven't been able to find any archival evidence for this, that this was all pre-prepared with the aim of capturing the West Bank. But what I'm clear about is that this was not a defensive war. It was a war that Israel initiated. Israel first fired the first shot, and Israel won the war and trebled its territory. Then the UN moved in, and it passed Resolution 242, which is essentially a package deal, land for peace. Israel withdraws from the occupied territories in return for peace and security with its neighbors. This is the only formula for peace, genuine peace between Israel and its neighbors. When the formula was put into practice, it worked. In 1979, Israel gave up the whole of Sinai, and it got a peace treaty with Egypt, which is still standing today. In 1994, Israel gave back the disputed territories in the Negev and Wadi Araba to Egypt, and got a peace treaty with with Jordan, which is still standing today. If Israel had agreed to give back, return the whole of the Golan Heights to Syrian sovereignty, Israel would have been able to have a peace treaty with Syria. But the Palestinians are different. Israel could have had peace with the Palestinians along the lines of the Oslo Accord, which involved withdrawing an end of occupation and an independent Palestinian state on Gaza in the West Bank with the capital city in East Jerusalem. But Israel clearly did not intend to end the occupation, only to repackage the occupation. And as a result, the Oslo Accord has been such a disappointment for the Palestinians, because they're in a much worse situation today than they were in 1993. And since Oslo, since 1993, there's been the so-called Oslo peace process. But the Oslo peace process was a charade. It was all about process and no peace. It was worse than a charade, because the very fact that Israel was talking to the Palestinians, to the Palestinian Authority, gave Israel just the cover it needed in order to pursue the aggressive Zionist colonial project on the West Bank, a project that continues today, that continues even as we speak.
Thank you, Avi. We're kind of running out of time, so I'd like to get to some questions, of which there are a few right now. I'd like to welcome the audience members to put your questions in the question and answers, and we will go through them and try and pose them to Dr. Shlaim. We have one here that I'd like to raise to Professor Shlaim related to the question of Jordan. This is from Dr. Ahmed Abdullah, who says, good afternoon. There's now a move by His Majesty King Abdullah of Jordan and Arab leaders to condemn the Israeli plans and to show that they are against the idea. The question is, what in your view does Israel think of these moves by Jordan and the Arab leaders, and might that prompt them to rethink the annexation, or will they still go ahead with their plans? Obviously, there's lots of talk around annexation potentially resulting in the collapse of the Wadi Araba peace agreement with Jordan. And potentially also, if I might add to that, that it might be a continuation of the plan to have Jordan oversee the West Bank, or it's the old school Jordan option. So your thoughts there, please.
The Arab League has denounced the idea of annexation. That's the collective Arab position. But Jordan is the country which would be most directly affected by annexation, because Jordan's policy was always based on UN Resolution 242 and Land for Peace. And in 1994, Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel. And that peace treaty recognizes Jordan's special status as the guardian of the Muslim holy places in the old city of Jerusalem. And Trump's recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the whole of Jerusalem completely ignores Jordan's legal rights in East Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem. So Jordan affected, and its position in the old city is threatened by this move towards annexation. But it's more than that. There are very, very close links between Jordan and the Palestinians on the West Bank, close family links, economic links, and so on. And if so Jordan ideally would like a two-state solution, but if annexation goes ahead, that would be the end of a two-state solution. But it would be worse than that for Jordan, because it would raise the threat of transfer, of mass expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank to the East Bank. And this is not an unreasonable fear on the part of Jordan. It would be a violation of the peace treaty. But the real fear is that a situation could arise in which there would be mass expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank to the East Bank, which would flood the East Bank and would threaten the integrity and would threaten the survival of the Hashemite monarchy of Jordan, which is why King Abdullah has come out so strongly and emphatically against annexation, while he is warned that it would have incalculable consequences, and his personal relationship with Netanyahu has broken down. For the last 2 years, the two leaders have not spoken. So Jordan is extremely worried. And there is, so one of the risks with annexation is that it would destabilize the peace treaties that Israel has with both Egypt and Jordan.
If I could follow up on what you just answered shortly, how realistic do you see that option being?
I have to go back in history to 1987, when Benjamin Netanyahu was deputy foreign minister, and he made a speech in the Knesset. And in that speech, he said, I am for a Palestinian state. And everyone was surprised. And then he said, but I'm not in favor of two Palestinian states. There is already a Palestinian state on the East Bank, and there is no need and no justification for a second Palestinian state on the West Bank. So this was the traditional policy of the Israeli right, that Jordan is Palestine. And I believe that this idea is still at the back of Netanyahu's mind, that he's not interested in the good relations with Jordan. He's not interested in the survival of the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, that it would suit him quite well if the PLO transformed the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan into the Republic of Palestine. And then there would be no pressure on Israel to agree to an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank. And moreover, those Palestinians who are disaffected and dissatisfied with their lives on the West Bank would be encouraged to move to the East Bank. I believe that that is at the back of Netanyahu's mind, that Jordan is Palestine, the traditional agenda of the extreme right in Israel.
Thank you. We have another question, this one from our former director of the Kenyon Institute, Dr. Mandy Turner, who's in Manchester right now. She writes, I'm interested what Professor Shlaim thought of Peter Beinart's recent conversation on the one-state solution and whether this is a tipping point for Jews in America and globally regarding the future of Zionism and Israel as a Jewish state. I thought it was significant with all the provisos that it comes very late and Palestinians have been campaigning for equal rights from the start, with the Oslo process having created a 30-year detour. Your thoughts?
Very good question indeed. And for the listeners who don't know what the question refers to, it's for an article, a paper by Peter Beinart, an American journalist and professor of journalism, and a leading proponent of liberal Zionism and of the two-state solution. So he's written a long paper and also an op-ed in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, in which he says he has given up on the two-state solution and he now supports a one-state solution in which there wouldn't be a Jewish state, but there would be a Jewish home. So one state, one democratic state with equal rights for all its citizens. And this was a very radical shift for him, and it generated a very intense debate in America and in Jewish communities elsewhere. And it's good that there is this debate. What the article points to clearly is that Palestinians and Israelis now live in one political space. De facto, the reality is of one state in which Israel has complete dominion. And this is incompatible with liberal Zionism. Until now, the alibi of liberal Zionists was that the occupation was only temporary. There was always the hope of an end of occupation, of a two-state solution. Now it's clear to Beinart that the two-state solution is no longer a possibility, and therefore he's drawn the conclusion that the only democratic solution that remains is a one-state solution with equal rights. I would just add that to me this has been evident at least since 2015, because in the lead up to the 2015 election, Netanyahu declared publicly that there will be no Palestinian state on his watch. He also revealed his racism by saying that the Palestinians are going in droves to the polling stations and calling on Israelis to go and vote. So since then, it has been clear that Israel has no intention of agreeing to any kind of a Palestinian state, however demilitarized or lacking in territorial congruity. So the alibi for liberal Zionism has now disappeared. And if you want a democratic settlement, the only one that remains is one state, which means that the Palestinian struggle has to shift from struggling for an independent state to struggling for equal rights. And in this sense, the questioner, Mandy, is quite right that Oslo was a detour because Oslo raised the hope of a two-state solution, and the Palestinian negotiators of Oslo had every reason to expect that it would end with a complete Israeli withdrawal and a two-state solution. But Israel rejected that possibility, continued to build settlements. So Oslo in this sense was a detour, and we now have to start afresh with a campaign for equal rights. And there is in fact an Israeli and Palestinian joint effort, and it's called the One Democratic State Campaign, and one of its leading members is Jeff Halper, the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolition. And I support this initiative. It's the only solution that is viable today, which would be democratic and liberal, because democracy, an essential element of democracy is equal rights. And in an apartheid state, there are no equal rights, whereas in a one-state solution, there would be equal rights for all citizens, regardless of the ethnicity or gender or faith.
Thank you for that. Perhaps following up, and there is another question for Sama Abdul Razak about the question of the one-state solution, because this seems to be one of the major sort of takeaways from the whole annexation debate, that it supposedly kills the two-state solution, and now it's creating a de facto, well, recognizing a one-state reality, and therefore we're in a situation where the nature of the struggle, well, perhaps the nature is not the right way, but the actual tactics or strategies that the actors, certainly on the Palestinian side and those who like yourself, are pushing towards one-state solution. However, I might challenge you there and perhaps ask the question of to what extent, particularly in light of the previous comment or answer that you gave regarding Netanyahu's back of his mind, can we find objective interest, so to speak, amongst you spoke about the Palestinian national movement changing its strategy to fight for one-state solution. Okay, first I would argue it's probably important to acknowledge that there already was an important shift in Palestinian strategy from their maximalist demands for liberation of Palestine to the two-state solution initially. Now there are new requests or calling for a one-state solution. So this is a second tactical or perhaps strategic shift on the behalf of that Palestinians are somehow being asked to consider, and some Palestinians and others are calling for it. But in the context of the strong power asymmetries that we have today, do you believe we have the conditions, because it obviously requires a partner on the Israeli side as well. And everything that we've seen up to this point is that from the works of new historians and what those have revealed to the policies of annexation, to the policies of what happened during Oslo, that there is less, there may be less evidence for such a constituency to be formed and to actually be able to generate those interests within the Israeli side. Is that possible? Where do you see that window of opportunity, especially in a context where de facto might has made right, and it has, so to speak, been able to create facts on the ground that have changed realities?
You're clearly right in saying that there has been a development in the Palestinian position, and the idea of a one-state solution is a not entirely new idea, because after 1967, the PLO came up with a program of one democratic secular state. So this is a variant on that, but it was mostly Palestinian intellectuals who took up the idea of a one-state solution, like Edward Said, like Ali Abu Nima, like Joseph Mas'ad, Diana Buttu. But in recent years, there's been a groundswell of support for the one state. And today, public opinion polls show that 2/3 of Palestinians are in favor of a one state. It's because of the disappointment with Oslo and the realization that they're not going to get a viable and independent Palestinian state. So there's been a real shift on the Palestinian side, but no parallel shift in Israeli public opinion. Israelis have voted for Netanyahu 3 times in the last 3 elections, although he is the opponent of a 2-state solution, because he is an opponent of a 2-state solution. So the Israelis don't favor an independent Palestinian state. Only a small minority of enlightened liberal Israelis support a 1-state solution. But there again, one public opinion poll in Israel showed that 37% are in favor of 1 state for 2 peoples. So I don't know how to interpret this statistic. It depends on how precisely you pose the question. But the potential is there to persuade more and more Israelis that this is the only legitimate solution. And here I think that the Palestinians themselves have to develop a vision that would appeal to Israelis. And so far, they haven't done so. The Palestinian leadership lacks legitimacy at home because it's about a decade since the last election. And the Palestinian Authority is seen as a collaborationist regime, as a subcontractor for Israeli security on the West Bank. So support for the Palestinian Authority has been going down and down. And the Palestinians need to elaborate a vision of 1 state with equal rights, which wouldn't pose such a stark threat to Israelis and their democracy. One positive development has been BDS, but BDS is not enough. BDS is a grassroots global movement which calls for the end of occupation, and all its aims are grounded, it's non-violent, and its main aims are grounded in international law and UN resolution, an end of occupation, equal rights, and the right of return. But BDS is not enough because it only calls for the end of occupation. But what then? And it's up to the Palestinians to develop a vision that would be attractive to a large number of Israelis. I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. But if Israel goes ahead with annexation, then it would clearly be perceived as an apartheid state, and I don't think that an apartheid state will survive, is sustainable in the 21st century.
Thank you. We're running out of time here, but I'd like to take at least one more question. This one comes from Magan Singodia, who writes, who asks the question around Biden and why has Biden stopped using the word occupation? But I'd like to sort of flesh out that question perhaps and ask, to what extent is what's happening today potentially reversible if Biden comes into power? Or if there's a major change in US policy? The presidency, excuse me.
Biden has spoken against occupation, but he has not gone as far as to say if he is elected, he will withdraw American recognition of Israeli sovereignty over that part of the West Bank. So Biden is not ready to take a position, a clear-cut position against continuing Israeli settlement expansion. I think he wants to play for time and not commit himself to a position which is strongly critical of Israel and off the settlements, because that may lose him votes. So his position is a bit ambiguous.
Would you like to follow up? I'd like to follow up by asking you a little bit perhaps about, because I know we have many European listeners to this webinar. What about the position of Europe in the context if this annexation policy actually does move forward? What do you see the governments will do? Is what their positions are now, is it sufficient? And will annexation somehow expose their position and force them to take much clearer sides or not?
The EU is a consistent supporter of the two-state solution, and the EU has real leverage with Israel, because Israel does more than 40% of its trade with EU, much more trade than with America, and Israel gets very beneficial trading arrangements with EU. So EU has real leverage with Israel, but it hasn't been able to use it because EU is internally divided, and some friends of Israel like Holland or Germany or the Czech Republic would always veto a resolution which calls for sanctions against Israel. But the EU foreign minister has made an important statement against annexation, pointing out that it would be illegal, a gross violation of international law, and it would entail consequences. He didn't spell what the consequences would be, but it is just possible that if Israel went a further step and actually annexed a third of the West Bank, that there would be enough support within EU for sanctions. Because EU has an trade association agreement with Israel, under which Israel has privileges access to the European market. Israel has abused that by including settlement products with Israeli products to the European market, although the settlements are illegal. And EU could say to Israel, the preamble to our association agreement is that you have to respect the human rights of all the people under your rule. You are violating Palestinian human rights, and therefore we will suspend the agreement until you live up to your side of the agreement by respecting Palestinian human rights. This hasn't happened yet. No sanctions have applied. Israeli governments don't take any notice of mild expressions of disapproval. But if there were real economic sanctions, then they will think again.
Well, thank you, Professor Shlaim, for your insights and for your commentary for the last hour and 15 minutes and your patience. They've been very enlightening, and we're very grateful for all that. So thank you, and I'm sure our audience members feel the same. So join me in thanking Professor Shlaim for his participation today. I'd like to welcome all members of the audience today to check out our website at cbrl.ac.uk to see what we do, and check out some previous webinars as well. This webinar, the podcast of which will be featured on our website as well as on SoundCloud. So check us out, sign up to our mailing list and become a member, and look forward to seeing you in the future. All the best. Thank you for everybody for attending today.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bless. Thank you. All the best.